And he had turned the Prime Minister's teacup into a gerbil.
After he sees you dead. Mandalane and Janwin hold their counsel, but they listen to Endirian and Timolan both. Ruark grimaced, sucking air between his teeth. For an Aiel, this was as much as tearing his hair in despair. It's not good news, Perrin protested, but you make it sound a death sentence. Once Rand shows himself, the rumors are done. Rand scrubbed a hand through his hair. If that was so, Sorlia wouldn't look like she had swallowed a lizard. For that matter, Nandera and Sulan looked as though their lizards were still alive on the way down. What haven't you told me yet, Sorlia? The leather-faced woman gave him a thin, approving smile. You see beyond what is said. Good. Her tone stayed flat as worked stone, though. You return with Aes Sedai. Some will believe that means you did bend knee. Whatever you say or do, they will believe you wear an Aes Sedai halter. And that is before it is known you were a prisoner. Secrets find crevices a flea could not slip through, and a secret known by so many has wings. Perrin eyed Dobrain and Norella, watching with their men, and swallowed queasily. How many of those who followed Rand did so because he had the weight of the Aiel massed behind him? Not all, certainly, but for every man who had chosen because Rand was the Dragon Reborn, 5 or even 10 had come because the light shone brightest on the strongest ranks. If the Aiel broke away, or splintered... He did not want to think about that possibility. Defending the Two Rivers had stretched his abilities as far as they would go, maybe farther. Ta'Veren or not, he had no illusions he was one of those men who ended up in the histories. That was for Rand. Village-sized problems were his limit. Yet he could not help himself. His mind churned. What to do if the worst came? Lists ran up in his head. Who would remain loyal, and who might try to slip away? The first list was sufficiently short, and the second sufficiently long to dry his throat. Too many people still schemed for advantage, as if they had never heard of the prophecies of the dragon or the last battle. He suspected some still would the day after Tarmangaden began. The worst of it was, most would not be dark friends, just people looking out for their own interests first. Loyal's ears hung limp. He saw it too. No sooner did Sorlia finish speaking to Rand than her eyes whipped to one side in a glare to bore holes in iron. You were told to remain in the wagon. Vera and Karuna came to an abrupt halt, and Alana nearly stumbled into them. You were told not to touch the One Power without permission, but you listened to what was said here. You will learn that I mean what I say. Despite Sorlia's auguring stare, the three held their ground. Vera and Karuna with icy dignity, Alana with smoldering defiance. Loyal's huge eyes rolled toward them, then toward the Wise One. If his ears had been limp before, now they wilted completely, and his long eyebrows dropped to his cheeks. Poring uneasily over his mental lists, Perrin wondered absently how far the Aes Sedai intended to push. Eavesdropping with the power? They might find a reaction from the Wise Ones worse than Sorlia's bark. From Rand, too. Not this time, however. Rand seemed unaware of them. He looked right through Sorlia. Or maybe he listened to something nobody else could hear again. What of the Wetlanders? He said finally. Colaver has been crowned queen, hasn't she? It was not really a question. Sorlia nodded, thumb tapping the hilt of her belt knife, but her attention never left the Aes Sedai. Who was chosen king or queen among the Wetlanders was of small concern to Aiel, especially among the tree-killing Carrienin. an icicle stabbed into Perrin's chest. That Coliver of House Saigon wanted the Sun Throne was no secret. She had schemed for it from the day Goldrian Riotin was assassinated, before Rand had even declared himself the Dragon Reborn, and kept scheming after it became public knowledge that Rand meant the throne for Elaine. Few knew she was a cold-blooded murderer, however, and Fail was in the city. At least she was not alone. Bane and Chiad would be close to her. They were maidens and her friends, maybe almost what the Aiel called near sisters. They would not let her be harmed. The icicle would not go away, though. Oliver hated Rand, and by extension, anyone close to Rand, such as perhaps the wife of a man who was Rand's friend. No, Bane and Chiad would keep her safe. This is a delicate situation. Moving closer to Rand, remarkably, Karuna ignored Sorlia. For such a scrawny woman, the Wise One had eyes like hammers. Whatever you do can have serious repercussions. What has Coliver said about me? Rand asked Sorlia in a too casual tone. Has she harmed Berelain? Berelain, the first of Mayenne, was who Rand had left in charge of Cairhien. Why did he not ask about Fail? Berelain Sir Pendrag is well, Sorlia murmured, without stopping her study of the Aes Sedai. Outwardly, Karuna stayed calm despite being interrupted and ignored, but the gaze she fixed on Rand could have frozen a forge fire solid with the bellows pumping. For the rest, Sorlia gestured to Ferregan. The red-haired woman gave a start and cleared her throat. Plainly, she had not expected to be allowed a word. She put dignity back on like a hastily donned garment. Coliver Saigon says you have gone to Cainlan, Karakarn, or maybe to Tyr, but wherever you have gone, all must remember that you are the Dragon Reborn and must be obeyed. Ferregan sniffed. The Dragon Reborn was no part of Aiel prophecies, only the Karakarn. She says you will return and confirm her on the throne. She speaks often to the chiefs, encouraging them to move the spears south. In obedience to you, she says. She does not see the Wise Ones, and hears only the wind when we speak. This time her sniff was a fair approximation of Sorlia's. No one told the clan chiefs what to do, but angering the Wise Ones was a bad way to start convincing the chiefs of anything. It made sense to Perrin, though, to the part of him that could think of anything besides Fail. Coliver probably had never paid enough attention to the savages to realize the Wise Ones did more than dispense herbs. But she would want every last Aiel out of Cairhien. The question was, given the circumstances, had any of the chiefs listened to her? But the question Rand asked was not the obvious. What else has happened in the city? Anything you've heard, Ferregan? Maybe something that might only seem important to a wetlander. She tossed her red mane contemptuously. Wetlanders are like sandflies, Karakarn. Who can know what they find important? Strange things sometimes happen in the city, so I have heard, as they do among the tents. People sometimes see things that cannot be. Only for a time what cannot be is. Men, women, children have died. Perrin's skin prickled. He knew she meant what Rand called bubbles of evil, rising from the Dark One's prison like froth in a fetid swamp, drifting along the pattern till they burst. Perrin had been caught in one once. He never wanted to see another. If you mean what the wetlanders do, she went on, who has time to watch sandflies, unless they bite? That minds me of one thing. I do not understand it, but perhaps you do. These sandflies will bite sooner or later. What sandflies? Wetlanders? What are you talking about? Ferregan was not as good as Sorlia at that level look, yet no Wise One that Perrin had seen appreciated others' impatience. Not even the Chief of Chiefs. Thrusting her chin up, she gathered her shawl and answered. 3 days ago, the tree killers, Caroline Damadred and Toram Riotin, approached the city. They issued a proclamation that Kolaver Saigon is a usurper, but they sit in their camp south of the city and do nothing except send a few people into the city now and then. Away from their camp, 100 of them will run from one Algaid Siswai, or even a Gaishain. The man called Darlan Cisnera and other Tyrans arrived by ship below the city yesterday and joined them. They have been feasting and drinking ever since, as if celebrating something. Tree killer soldiers gather in the city at Kolver Saigon's command, yet they watch our tents more than they do the other wetlanders or the city itself. They watch and do nothing. Perhaps you know the why of all this, Karakan, but I do not. Nor does Bear or Magana, or anyone else in the tents. Lady Caroline and Lord Toram led the Karienen who refused to accept that Rand and the Aiel had conquered Karien, just as High Lord Darlan led their counterparts in Tyr. Neither revolt amounted to much. Caroline and Toram had been sitting in the foothills of the spine of the world for months, making threats and claims, and Darlan the same down in Haddon Merk. But not any longer, it seemed. Aaron found himself running a thumb lightly along the edge of his axe. The Aiel were in danger of slipping away, and Rand's enemies were coming together in one place. All it needed now was for the Forsaken to appear, and Savannah with her Shido. That would put the cream on the honey cake. Yet none of it was any more important than whether somebody saw a nightmare walking. Aiel had to be saved. She just had to be. Better watching than fighting, Rand murmured thoughtfully, listening to something unseen again. Perrin agreed with Rand wholeheartedly. Just about anything was better than fighting. But Aiel did not see it that way, not when it came to enemies. From Ruark to Soralea, Foregan to Nandera and Sulin, they stared as though Rand had said sand was better to drink than water. Foregan drew herself up practically on tiptoe. She was not particularly tall for an Aiel woman, not quite to Rand's shoulder, but she appeared to be trying to put herself nose to nose. There are few more than 10,000 in that wetlander camp, she said reprovingly, and fewer in the city. They can be dealt with easily. Even Indirian remembers that you command no wetlander killed, except in self-defense. But they will make trouble left to themselves. It does not help that there are Aes Sedai in the city. Who can know what they... Aes Sedai. The words came out cold, Rand's knuckles white on the dragon scepter. How many? At the smell of him, the skin between Perrin's shoulders crawled. Suddenly he could feel the Aes Sedai prisoners watching, and Bera and Karuna and the rest. Soralea lost all interest in Karuna. Her hands planted themselves on her hips, and her mouth narrowed. Why did you not tell me this? You gave me no chance, Soralea, Foregan protested a touch breathily, shoulders hunching. Blue eyes swung to Rand, and her voice firmed. There may be as many as 10 or more, Karakan. We avoid them, of course, especially since... Back to Soralea and breathiness. You did not want to hear about the wetlanders, Soralea. Only our own tents. You said so. To Rand, her back straightening. Most of them stay beneath the roof of Arlen Dulain, Karakan, and seldom leave it. To Soralea, hunching. Soralea, you know I would have told you everything. You cut me short. As she realized how many were watching, and how many beginning to smile, among the wise ones anyway, Foregan's eyes grew wild and her cheeks reddened. Her head swung between Rand and Soralea, and her mouth worked, but no sound came out. Some of the wise ones began laughing behind their hands. Idara did not bother with a hand. Ruark threw back his head and roared. Perrin certainly did not feel like laughing. And Aiel could find something funny in having a sword stuck through him. Aes Sedai on top of everything else. Light. He cut straight through to what was important. Foregan, my wife, Aiel. Is she well? She gave him a half-distracted stare, then visibly pulled together the tatters of her poise. I think Fail Ebara is well, Saikar, she said with cool composure. Or almost. She tried to sneak glances at Soralea from the corner of her eye. Soralea was not amused, or anything close to it. Arms folded, she gave Ferregan a perusal that made the one she had given Karuna seem mild. Amis put a hand on Sorlia's arm. "She is not at fault," the younger woman murmured, too softly to reach any ears but the leathery wise ones and Perrin's. Sorlia hesitated, then nodded. The flaying glare faded to her usual cantankerous. Amis was the only one Perrin had seen able to do that, the only one Sorlia did not trample down when she got in her way. Well, she did not trample Ruark, but with him it was more a boulder ignoring a thunderstorm. Amis could make it stop raining. Perrin wanted more of Ferregan. She thought Fail was well? But before he could open his mouth, Karuna bulled in with her usual tact. "Now listen to me carefully," she told Rand, gesturing emphatically under his nose. "I called the situation delicate. It is not. The situation is complex beyond your imagining. So fragile a breath could shatter it. Bera and I will accompany you to the city. Yes, Ilana, and you as well." She waved away the slender Aes Sedai impatiently. Perrin thought she was trying that looming trick. She did seem to be peering down her nose at Rand. Though tall as she was, he stood head and shoulders taller. "You must let yourself be guided by us. One wrong move, one wrong word, and you may deliver to Kyrian the same disaster you gave Taraban and Aradoman. Worse, you can do incalculable damage to matters about which you know almost nothing." Perrin winced. The whole speech could not have been better designed to inflame Rand. But Rand simply listened till she was done, then turned to Sorlia. "Take the Aes Sedai to the tents. All of them, for now. Make sure everyone knows they're Aes Sedai. Let it be seen that they hop when you say toad. Since you hop when the Karn says it, that should convince everybody I'm not wearing an Aes Sedai leash." Karuna's face grew bright red. She smelled of outrage and indignation so strongly that Perrin's nose itched. Bera tried to calm her, without much success, while shooting "you ignorant young lout" looks at Rand, and Alana bit her lip in an effort not to smile. Going by the odors drifting from Sorlia and the others, Alana had no reason to be pleased. Sorlia gave Rand a slash of smile. "Perhaps, Karakarn," she said dryly. Perrin doubted that she hopped for anyone. "Perhaps it will." She did not sound convinced. With another shake of his head, Rand stalked off with Min, shadowed by the maidens and issuing orders as to who was to go with him and who with the wise ones. Ruark began ordering the Siswayaman. Alana followed Rand with her eyes. Perrin wished he knew what was going on there. Sorley and the others watched Rand too, and they smelled anything but gentle. Ferregan was standing alone, he realized. Now was his chance. But when he tried to catch her up, Sorlia and Amis and the rest of the council surrounded her, neatly shouldering him away. They moved some distance before they began showering her with questions, the sharp looks directed at Karuna and the two other sisters, leaving no doubt they would tolerate no further eavesdropping. Karuna appeared to be considering it, glowering till it seemed to wonder her dark hair was not standing on end. Bera was speaking to her firmly, and without trying, Perrin heard sensible and patient, cautious and foolish. Which applied to whom was not evident. "There will be fighting when we reach the city." Aram sounded eager.
"Of course not,"
Oil said stoutly. His ears twitched, and he peered uncomfortably at his axe.
"There won't be, will there, Perrin?"
Perrin shook his head. He did not know. If only the other wise ones would leave Ferregan alone just for a few moments. What did they have to talk about that was so important? "Women," Gaul muttered, "are stranger than drunken wetlanders." "What?" Perrin said absently. What would happen should he simply push through the circle of wise ones? As if she had read his mind, Dara gave him a pointed frown. So did some of the others. Sometimes it did seem women could read men's minds. Well... "I said women are strange, Perne Bara. Chiad told me she would not lay a bridal wreath at my feet. She actually told me. The Aielman sounded scandalized. She said she would take me for a lover, her and Bane, but no more. Another time, that would have shocked Perrin, though he had heard it before. Aiel were incredibly free about such things. As if I am not good enough for a husband, Gall snorted angrily. I do not like Bane, but I would marry her to make Chiad happy. If Chiad will not make a bridal wreath, she should stop trying to entice me. If I cannot catch her interest well enough for her to marry me, she should let me go. Perrin frowned at him. The green-eyed Aielman was taller than Rand, nearly a head taller than he. What are you talking about? Chiad, of course. Have you not been listening? She avoids me, but every time I see her, she pauses long enough to make sure I have seen her. I do not know how you wetlanders do it, but with us, that is one of the ways a woman uses. When you least expect her, she is in your eyes, then gone. I did not even know she was with the maidens until this morning. You mean she's here? Perrin whispered. That icicle was back now a blade, hollowing him out. And Bane. Here too? Gall shrugged. One is seldom far from the other. But it is Chiad's interest I want, not Bane's. Burn your bloody interest, Perrin shouted. The wise ones turned to look at him. In fact, people all over the hillside did. Karuna and Bera were staring, faces entirely too thoughtful. With an effort, he managed to lower his voice. He could do nothing about the intensity, though. They were supposed to be protecting her. She's in the city, in the royal palace with Kolaver. With Kolaver. And they were supposed to be protecting her. Scratching his head, Gall looked at Loyal. Is this wetlander humor? Faile Bara is out of short skirts. I know she's not a child. Perrin drew a deep breath. It was very hard keeping a level tone with his belly full of acid. Loyal, will you explain to Gall, that our women don't run around with spears? That Kolaver wouldn't offer to fight Faile. She'd just order somebody to cut her throat, or throw her off a wall, or... The images were too much. He was going to empty his stomach in a moment. Loyal patted him awkwardly on the shoulder.
Aaron, I know you're worried. I know how I'd feel if I thought anything happened to Aerith.
The tufts on his ears quivered. He was a fine one to talk. He would run as hard as he could to avoid his mother and the young Ogier woman she had chosen for him.
Well... Perrin, Faile is waiting for you safe and sound. I know it. And you know she can care for herself. Why, she could care for herself and you and me and Gall as well.
His booming voice sounded forced, and it quickly faded to grave seriousness.
Perrin, you know you can't always be there to protect Faile, however much you want to. You are ta'veren. The pattern spun you out for a purpose, and it will use you for that purpose.
Burn the pattern, Perrin growled. It can all burn, if it keeps her safe. Loyal's ears went rigid with shock, and even Gall looked taken aback. What does that make me? Perrin thought. He had been scornful of those who scribbled and scrabbled for their own ends, ignoring the last battle and the Dark One's shadow creeping over the world. How was he different from them? Rand reined the black in beside him. Are you coming? I'm coming, Perrin said bleakly. He had no answer for his own questions, but he knew one thing. To him, Faile was the world. Chapter 4. Into Cairhien. Perrin would have set a harder pace than Rand did, though he knew the horses could not have stood it long. Half the time they rode at a trot, the other half ran alongside their animals. Rand seemed unaware of anyone else, except that he always had a hand for Min if she stumbled. For the rest, he was lost in some other world, blinking in surprise when he noticed Perrin or Loyal. Truth to tell, nobody was any better. Dobrain's men and Javian's stared straight ahead, chewing their own worries over what they would find. The Two Rivers men had soaked in Perrin's dark mood. They liked Fail. Truth be told, some worshipped her. And if she had been hurt in any way... Even Aram's eagerness grew bleak once he realized that Fail might be in danger. Every man focused on the leagues before them, toward the city ahead. Except for the Ashaman, anyway. Close behind Rand, like a cluster of ravens, they studied the country the column crossed, still wary of an ambush. Dashiva slumped in his saddle like a sack and muttered darkly to himself when he had to run. He glared as if he hoped there was an ambush. Small chance of that. Suolin and a dozen Fardarais Mai trotted ahead of the column in Perrin's sight, with as many more farther ahead, probing the way, and an equal number on the flanks. Some had thrust their short spears into the harnesses that held their bow cases on their backs, so the spearheads bobbed above their heads. The short horn bows were out, arrows knocked. They kept equally sharp watch for anything that might threaten the Ka Karn, and on Rand himself, as though they suspected he might vanish again. If any trap waited, any danger approached, they would find it. Chiad was one of the maidens with Suolin, a tall woman with dark reddish hair and gray eyes. Perrin stared at her back, willing her to drop behind the others and speak to him. Now and then she spared him a glance, but she avoided him, as if he had 3 diseases, all catching.
Excuse me.
Bane was not with the column. Most of the maidens followed much the same route with Ruark and the Algaid Siswai, but moving more slowly because of the wagons and prisoners. Fail's black mare trotted behind Stepper, her reins tied to his saddle. The Two Rivers men had brought Swallow from Camelin when they joined him before Dumai's Wells. Every time he looked at the mare prancing along behind him, his wife's face swelled in his thoughts, her bold nose and generous mouth, flashing dark eyes tilted above high cheekbones. She loved the animal, maybe almost as much as she did him. A woman as proud as she was beautiful, as fiery as she was proud. Davram Bashir's daughter would not hide or even hold her tongue. Not for the likes of Colabert. 4 times they stopped to rest the mounts, and he ground his teeth at the delay. Taking good care of horses was second nature to him. He checked Stepper absently, gave the stallion a little water by rote. Swallow he was more careful with. If Swallow reached Kyrian safely, a notion had planted itself in his mind. If he brought her mare to Kyrian, Fail would be all right. It was ludicrous, a boy's fancy, a small boy's foolish fancy, and it would not go away. At each of those stops, Min tried to reassure him. With a bantering grin, she said he looked like death on a winter morning, just waiting for somebody to shovel his grave full. She told him if he approached his wife with a face like that, Fail would slam the door on him. But she had to admit that none of her viewings promised that Fail was unharmed. "Light, Perrin," she said at last in exasperated tones, snugging her gray riding gloves. "If anyone tries to harm the woman, she'll make him wait out in the hall till she has time for him." He very nearly growled at her. It was not that the two disliked each other exactly. Loyal reminded Perrin that hunters for the Horn could take care of themselves, that Fail had survived Trollocs unscathed.
She is well, Perrin.
He boomed heartily, trotting beside Stepper with his long axe across his shoulders.
I know she is.
But he said the same 20 times, and each time he sounded a little less hearty. The Ogier's final attempt at heartening went further than Loyal intended.
I am sure Fail can look after herself, Perrin. She is not like Aerith. I can hardly wait for Aerith to make me her husband so I can tend her. I think I'd die if she changed her mind.
At the end of that, his mouth remained open, and his huge eyes popped. Ears fluttering, he stumbled over his own boots and nearly fell.
I never meant to say that,
he said hoarsely, striding along beside Perrin's horse once more. His ears still trembled.
I am not sure I want to... I'm too young to get...
Swallowing hard, he gave Perrin an accusing look and spared one for Rand up ahead, too.
It is hardly safe to open your mouth with two Taviran about. Anything at all might come out.
Nothing that might not have come off his tongue anyway, as he well knew. Though it might have happened one time in 1,000, or 1,000 times 1,000, without Taviran there. Loyal knew that also, and the fact of it seemed to frighten him as much as anything Perrin had ever seen. Some considerable time passed before the Ogier's ears stopped shaking. Fail filled Perrin's mind, but he was not blind, not completely. What he at first saw without seeing, as they rode south and west, began to seep in at the edges. The weather had been hot when he headed north from Kyrian less than 2 weeks ago, yet it seemed the Dark One's touch had gained a harder hold, grinding the land more desperately than before. Brittle grass crackled beneath the horses' hooves, shriveled brown creepers spiderwebbed rocks on the hillsides, and naked branches, not merely leafless but dead, cracked and the wind gusted. Evergreen pine and leatherleaf stood brown and yellow, often as not. Farms had begun appearing after a few miles, plain structures of dark stone laid out in squares, the first in isolated clearings in the forest, then coming as thickly as the woodland thinned to trees hardly deserving the name. A cart road straggled there, running over the shoulders and crests of hills, accommodating stone-walled fields more than the terrain. Most of those early farms looked deserted. Here a ladder-back chair lying on its side in front of a farmhouse, there a rag doll by the roadside. Slat-ribbed cattle and lethargic sheep dotted pastures where frequently ravens squabbled over carcasses. Hardly a pasture but had a carcass or two. Streams ran in trickles down channels of dried mud. Cropland that should have been blanketed with snow looked ready to crumble to dust, where it was not dust already, blowing away. A tall plume of dust marked the passage of the column until the narrow dirt way joined the broad stone-paved road that led from Jengai Pass. Here there were people, though few, and those often lethargic, dull-eyed. With the sinking sun almost halfway down to the horizon now, the air was an oven. The occasional ox cart or horse-drawn wagon hurried off the road, down narrow tracks or even into fields out of the way. The drivers and the handful of farm folk in the open stood blank-faced as they watched the three banners pass. Close to 1,000 armed men was reason enough to stare. 1,000 armed men heading somewhere in a hurry with a purpose. Reason enough to stare and be thankful when they passed out of sight. At last, when the sun had less than twice its own height yet to fall, the road topped a rise, and there 2 or 3 miles before them lay Kyrian. Rand drew rein, and the maidens, all together now, dropped to their heels where they were. They kept those sharp eyes out, though. Nothing could be seen moving on the nearly treeless hills around the city. A great mass of gray stone sinking toward the river Algueña on the west, square-walled, square-towered, and stark. Ships of all sizes lay anchored in the river, and some tied to the docks of the far bank, where the granaries were. A few vessels moved under sail or long sweeps. They gave an impression of peace and prosperity. With not a cloud in the sky, the light was sharp, and the huge banners flying from the city's towers stood plain enough to Perrin when the wind unfurled them. The scarlet banner of light and the white dragon banner with its serpentine creature scaled scarlet and gold. The wavy-rayed rising sun of Kyrian, gold on blue. And a fourth, given equal prominence with the rest. A silver diamond on a field checked yellow and red. Lowering a small looking-glass from his eye, a scowling doughbrain stuffed it into a worked leather tube tied to his saddle. I hoped the savages had it wrong somehow. But if House Saigon flies with the rising sun, Kolover has the throne. She will be distributing gifts in the city every day. Coin, food, finery. It is traditional for the coronation festival. A ruler is never more popular than for the week after taking the throne. He eyed Rand sideways. The strain of speaking straight out hollowed his face. The commoners could riot if they dislike what you do. The streets could run with blood. Avian's gray gelding danced his rider's impatience, and the man himself kept looking from Rand to the city and back. It was not his city. He had made it clear earlier that he cared little what ran in the streets, so long as his own ruler was safe. For long moments, Rand studied the city, or seemed to anyway. Whatever he saw, his face was bleak. Men studied him, worriedly, maybe pityingly. "I will try to see they don't," he said at last. "Flynn, remain here with the soldiers. Min," she broke in on him sharply. "No. I am going where you go, Randall Thor. You need me and you know it." The last sounded more plea than demand. But when a woman planted her fists on her hips that way and fixed her eyes to you, she was not begging.
I am going too,
Loyal added, leaning on his long hafted axe.
You always manage to do things when I'm somewhere else.
His voice took on a plaintive edge.
It won't do, Rand. It will not do for the book. How can I write about things if I am not there?
Still looking at Min, Rand half raised a hand toward her, then let it fall. She met his gaze levelly. "This is madness." Holding his reins stiffly, Dashiva booted the plump mare closer to Rand's black. Reluctance twisted his features. Perhaps even Ashaman worried at being too near Rand. "All it needs is one man with a bow or a knife, and you don't see him in time. Send one of the Ashaman to do what needs doing, or more, if you think it's necessary. A gateway to the palace. And it can be done before anyone knows what has happened." "And sit here past dark," Rand cut in, reining his gelding around to face Dashiva. "Until they know this place well enough to open one? That way brings bloodshed for sure. They've seen us from the walls, unless they're blind. Sooner or later they will send somebody to find out who we are and how many." The rest of the column remained hidden behind the rise, and the banners were down there too. But men sitting their horses on a ridge with maidens for company would indeed attract curiosity. "I will do this my way." His voice rose in anger, and he smelled of cold fury. "Nobody dies unless it can't be avoided, Dashiva. I've had a belly full of death. Do you understand me? Nobody." "As my Lord Dragon commands." The fellow inclined his head, but he sounded sour, and he smelled... Perrin rubbed his nose. The smell skittered, dodging wildly through fear and hate and anger and a dozen more emotions, almost too quickly to make out. He no longer doubted the man was mad, however good a face the fellow put on. Perrin no longer really cared either. This close. Digging his heels into Stepper's flanks, he started for the city and Fail, not waiting for the rest, barely noticing Aram close behind. He did not have to see Aram to know he would be there. All he could think of was Fail. If he got Swallow safely into the city, he made himself keep Stepper at no more than a quick walk. The galloping rider drew eyes and questions and delays. At that pace, he hadn't caught up with Aram and him fast enough. They were coming. Min had gotten her way, it seemed, and so had left. The maidens fanned out ahead, giving Perrin sympathetic looks as they trotted by. Giad studied the ground until she was beyond him. "I still don't like this plan," Avian muttered on one side of Rand. "Forgive me, my Lord Dragon, but I do not." Dobrain, on Rand's other side, grunted. "We have been over that, Mayenna. If we did as you want, they would close the gates on us before we covered a mile." Avian growled something under his breath and danced his horse a few paces. He had wanted every man to follow Rand into the city. Perrin glanced over his shoulder at the Ashaman. Min and Flynn, recognizable by his coat, and a few of the Two Rivers men were visible on the ridge, standing and holding their horses. Perrin sighed. He would not have minded having the Two Rivers men along. Rand was probably right, and Dobrain had backed him up. A few men could enter, where a small army could not. If the gates were shut, the Aiel would have to besiege the city, if they still would, and then the killing began anew. Rand had stuffed the dragon scepter into one of the gelding's saddlebags, so just the carved butt stuck out. And that plain coat looked like nothing the Dragon Reborn would wear. For the Ashaman, nobody in the city had any idea what a black coat meant. A few men were easier to kill than a small army, too, even if most of them could channel. Aaron had seen an Ashaman take a Shido spear through his belly, and the man had died no harder than any other. Dashiva grumbled under his breath. Aaron thought hero and fool in equally disparaging tones. Without Fail, he might have agreed. Once Rand peered toward the Aiel encampment sprawled over the hills 2 or 3 miles east of the city, and Perrin held his breath. But whatever thoughts Rand had, he kept on the road. Nothing mattered more than Fail. Nothing, whether or not Rand saw it so. A good half-mile short of the gates, they rode into another camp, one that made Perrin frown. It was big enough for a city itself, a thick band of ramshackle brush huts and rickety tents made from scraps, on burned-over ground, clinging to the high gray walls as far as he could see. This had been called Foregate once, warren of twisting streets and alleys, before the Shido burned it. Some of the people stared in silence as the strange party passed, had no gear and Aiel maidens, but most scuttled about their business with wary, sullen faces and a care to notice nothing that was not right in front of them. The bright colors and often tattered cast-off finery worn by Foregaters mingled with the somber garb more usual for Kyrienin, the plain, dark clothes of villagers and farmers. The Foregaters had been in the city when Perrin left, along with thousands of refugees from deeper inside the country. Most of those faces bore bruises, and worse, cuts and slashes, often unbandaged. Kolaver must have put them out. They would not have left the shelter of the walls on their own. Foregaters and refugees alike feared the return of the Shido, the way a man who had been seared to the bone feared hot iron. The road ran straight through the camp to the Jangai gates, 3 tall square arches flanked by towers. Helmeted men lounged up on the battlements, peering down through the gaps in the stone teeth. Some stared off toward the men on the hilltop, and here and there an officer with a con held a looking glass to his eye. Rand's small party drew inquiring glances. Men a horseback and Aiel maidens, not common companions. Crossbows showed atop the serrated wall, but no one raised a weapon. The iron-bound gates stood open. Perrin held his breath. He wanted very much to gallop for the Sun Palace and Fail. Just inside the gates sat a squat stone guardhouse, where strangers to the city were supposed to register before entering. A square-faced Kyrienin officer watched them pass with a disgruntled frown, eyeing the maidens uneasily. He just stood there watching. "As I told you," Dobrain said once they were by the guardhouse. Kolover gave free access to the city for Coronation Festival. Not even someone under order of arrest can be denied or detained. It is tradition. He sounded relieved, though. Min sighed audibly, and Loyal let out a breath that could have been heard 2 streets over. Perrin's chest was still too tight for sighing. Swallow was inside Kyrien. Now, if he could only get her to the royal palace. Up close, Kyrien carried out what it had promised from afar. The highest of the hills lay inside the walls, but terraced and faced with stone, till they no longer seemed hills at all. Broad, crowded streets met at right angles. In this city, even the alleys made a grid. The streets rose and fell reluctantly with the hills, often simply cutting through. From tops to palaces, the buildings were all stark squares and severe rectangles. Even the great buttressed towers, each wrapped in scaffolding on a hilltop, the once fabled topless towers of Kyrien, still being rebuilt after burning in the Aiel War. The city seemed harder than stone, a bruising place, and shadows stretching across everything heightened the effect. Loyal's tufted ears twitched almost without stopping. A worried frown creased his forehead, and his damping eyebrows brushed his cheek. There were few signs of Coronation Festival or High Chazaline. Perrin had no notion what the festival might entail, but in the Two Rivers, the Day of Reflection was a time of merriment and forgetting the bleakness of winter. Here, a near hush hung in the air, despite the number of people. Anywhere else, Perrin might have thought it the unnatural heat dragging people's spirits down, but except for four gators, Karienen were a sober, austere lot. On the surface, at least. What lay underneath, he would as soon not think about. The hawkers and cart peddlers he remembered and brought in the streets, the musicians and tumblers and upstairs. Those people would be in the ragtag camp outside the walls. A few closed, dark-painted sedan chairs threaded through the quiet throngs, some with house banners a little larger than Khan's standing stiffly above. They moved as slowly as the ox carts, with goad-wielding drivers walking alongside, axles squealing in the stillness. Outlanders stood out, no matter how little color they wore, because few except Outlanders rode. The almost relatively shorter natives, like pale-faced crows in their dark garb. Aiel stood out too, of course. Whether one alone or 10 together, they walked in clearings through the crowds. Eyes darted away and space just opened up around them wherever they went. Aiel faces turned toward the party as it made its slow way through the crowds. Even if not all recognized Rand in his green coat, they knew who a tall wetlander escorted by maidens. Those faces sent a chill down Perrin's spine. Considering. They made him thankful Rand had left all the Aes Sedai behind. Aside from the Aiel, the Dragon Reborn moved through a river of unconcern that parted for the maidens and closed in again behind the Ashaman. The royal palace of Karien, the Sun Palace, the Palace of the Rising Sun in Splendor. Karienen were great ones for names, each more extravagant than the last. Stood atop the highest hill in the city, a dark mass of square stone with stepped towers looming above. The street, the Way of the Crown, became a long, broad ramp rising toward the palace, and Perrin drew a deep breath as they started up. Bail was up there. She had to be, and safe. Whatever else, she had to be safe. He touched the knot holding Swallow's reins to a ring on his pommel, stroked the axe at his waist. The horse's shod hooves rang loudly on the paving stones. The maidens made no sound at all. The guards on the great open bronze gate watched their slow approach and exchanged glances. They were colorful Pythagorean soldiers, 10 men with the rising sun in gold on their dark breastplates and scarves in House Saigon's colors tied below the heads of their halberds. Perrin could have written out their thoughts. 13 men on horseback, but in no hurry, and only 2 wearing armor, 1 in Mayena red. Any trouble would come from Caroline Damadred or Toram Lyaton. Mayeners had no place in that. And there was a woman and an ogier. Surely they intended no trouble. Still, 3 dozen or so maidens trotting ahead of the horses hardly looked as though they were coming for tea. For an instant, all hung balanced. Then a maiden veiled herself. The guards jerked as if goosed, and one slanted his halberd and darted for the gates. 2 steps he took, and stopped, rigid as a statue. Every guard stood stiff. Nothing moved but their heads. Good, Rand murmured. Now tie off the flows and leave them for later. Perrin shrugged uncomfortably. The Ashaman had spread out behind, taking up most of the width of the ramp. They must be using the one power. Very likely, the 8 of them could tear the whole palace apart. Maybe Rand could have by himself. But if those towers began spewing crossbow bolts, they would die with everyone else, caught in the open on this ramp that no longer seemed so wide. Nobody stood up. Any eyes at the tall, narrow windows of the palace, and the colonnaded walks high above, must see nothing out of the ordinary. Sulin flashed maiden hand talk, and the one who had veiled lowered the black cloth hurriedly, face flushing. A slow walk up the stone ramp. Some of the guards' helmeted heads shook wildly, eyes rolling. One seemed to have fainted, slumping upright with his chin on his chest. Their mouths strained, open, but no sound came out. Perrin tried not to think about what had gagged them. A slow walk through the open bronze gates into the main courtyard. There were no soldiers here. The stone balconies around the courtyard stood empty. Liveried servants rushed out with downcast eyes to take the horses' reins and hold stirrups. Stripes of red and yellow and silver ran down the sleeves of otherwise dark coats and dresses, and each had the rising sun small in the left breast. That was more color than Perrin had seen on a Carianan servant before. They could not see the guards outside, and likely would have done little different if they had. In Carian, servants played their own version of Deus de Mar, the game of houses, but they pretended to ignore the doings of those above them. Taking too much notice of what happened among your betters, or at least being seen to take notice, might mean being caught up in it. In Carian, maybe in most lands, ordinary folk could be crushed unnoticed where the mighty walked. A blocky woman led Stepper and Swallow away without really looking at him. Swallow was inside the Sun Palace, and it made no difference. He still did not know whether Fail was alive or dead. A fool boy's fool fancy. Shifting his axe at his hip, he followed Rand up the broad gray stairs at the far end of the courtyard and nodded when Aram reached over his shoulder again to ease his sword. Liveried men swung open the great doors at the head of the stairs, bronze like the outer gates, and marked large with the rising sun of Carian. Once, the entry hall would have stunned Perrin with its grandeur. Thick square columns of dark marble held a square vaulted ceiling 10 paces above floor tiles that alternated dark blue and deep gold. Gilded rising suns marched around the cornices, and friezes carved in the walls showed Carianan triumphs in battle. The hall was empty, save for a handful of young men clustered beneath one of the friezes who fell silent when Perrin and the rest entered. Not all men, he realized. All wore swords, but 4 of the 7 were women, in coats and snug breeches, much like men's, their hair cut short as the men's. Not that that was particularly short. Men and women alike had it gathered in a kind of tail that reached their shoulders, tied with a dark ribbon. One of the women wore green a little paler than normal for Carianan, and another bright blue. All the rest were in dark colors, with a few bright stripes across their chests. They studied Rand's party, with an especial view for himself, Perrin realized. His yellow eyes took people aback, although he hardly noticed it anymore unless somebody jumped or made a commotion. Studied in silence until the last of the Ashaman was in, and the doors swung shut. The boom of the closing covered a moment of fierce whispering. Then they came swaggering closer, the women strutting even more arrogantly than the men, which took some doing. Even the way they knelt was arrogant. The green-clad woman glanced at the one in blue, who had her head down, and said, "My Lord Dragon, I am Camille Nolason. Salanda Darangil leads our society." She blinked at a fierce look from the woman in blue. Despite the glare, Salanda smelled afraid to her bones, if Perrin was making out who was who properly. Clearing her throat, Camille went on. We did not expect you to return so soon." "Yes," Rand said softly. "I doubt anyone thought I would return so soon. None of you has any reason to be afraid of me. None at all. If you believe anything, believe that." Surprisingly, he looked right at Salanda when he said that. Her head whipped up, and as she stared at him, the fear smell faded. Not completely, but down to a tatter. How had Rand known it was there? "Where is Colaver?" Rand asked. Camille opened her mouth, but it was Salanda who answered. "In the Grand Hall of the Sun." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the scent of her fear growing weaker. Oddly, a slight tinge of jealousy touched it once, just for an instant, when she glanced at Min. Sometimes his sense of smell was more confusing than enlightening. It is the third sunset convocation, she went on. We are not important enough to attend. Besides, I think we of the societies make her uneasy.
The third, Dobrain muttered. The 9th sunset after her coronation already. She wasted no time. At least they will all be together. No one of any rank or pretension will miss it, Karianen or Tyran. Drawing herself up on her knees, Salanda managed to make it seem she was meeting Rand eye to eye.
We are ready to dance the blades for you, my Lord Dragon.
Sulan shook her head, wincing, and another maiden groaned audibly. Several looked and smelled ready to do some violence then and there. The Aiel could not decide what to make of these young wetlanders. The problem in Aiel eyes were that they were trying to be Aiel, in a way, to follow Giotto. Their version of it, anyway. These 7 were not the lot. Hundreds of the idiots at least could be found all over the city, organized into societies in imitation of the Aiel. Half the Aiel Perrin had heard mention them wanted to help. The other half wanted to strangle them. For himself, he did not care whether they mangled Giotto to mincemeat.
Where is my wife? He demanded. Where is Fail?
The young fools exchanged guarded looks.
Guarded? She is in the Grand Hall of the Sun, Salanda said slowly. She is one of Queen of Coliver's lady attendants. Put your eyes back in your head, Baron, Min whispered. She must have a good reason. You know she must.
Shrugging inside his coat, Perrin tried to gather himself.
One of Coliver's attendants?
Whatever her reason, it must be good. That much he was sure of. But what could it be? Salanda and the others were passing those guarded looks about again. One of the men, a young fellow with a pointed nose, whispered fierce and low,
We swore not to tell anyone. Not anyone. On water oath.
Before Perrin could demand to be told, Rand spoke.
Salanda, lead the way to the Grand Hall. There will be no blades. I am here to see justice done to all who deserve it.
Something in his voice made Perrin's hackles rise. A hardness grim as a hammer's face.
Fail did have a good reason. She had to.
Chapter 5. A Broken Crown. Wide and tall as the corridors were, they felt close, and dim despite tall gilded stand lamps with mirrors on every branch, lit wherever daylight could not penetrate. Tapestries hung few and far between on the walls, scenes of hunt or battle with people and animals, arranged more precisely than ever nature had. Scattered niches held bowls and vases, and now and then a small statue, in gold or silver or alabaster, but even the statues seemed to emphasize that they were stone or metal, as if the sculptors had tried to banish curves. The city's hush was magnified here. The sound of their boots on the floor tiles echoed, a hollow foreboding march, and Perrin did not think it was so to his ears alone. Loyals quivered at every other step, and he peered down crossing corridors, as though wondering what might leap out. Min held herself stiffly and took ginger steps, grimacing ruefully when she glanced at Rand. She seemed to make an effort not to walk closer to him, and not particularly pleased with herself over it. The young Karianen started off swaggering like peacocks, but that arrogance faded as the drumming of their heels reverberated. Even the maidens felt it. Sulan was the only one whose hand did not sometimes rise toward the veil hanging down her chest. There were servants everywhere, of course, pale, narrow-faced men and women in dark coats and dresses with the rising sun on the left breast, and sleeves striped in Coliver's colors. Some gaped in recognition as Rand passed by. A handful dropped to their knees, heads bowed. Most went on about their tasks after a small pause for deep bow or curtsy. It was just as in the courtyard. Show proper respect to your betters, whoever they are. Obey them and otherwise ignore what they do, and perhaps you will not be entangled in it.
It was a way of thinking that set Perrin's teeth on edge. Nobody should have to live that way. Two fellows in Coliver's livery, standing before the gilt-covered doors to the Grand Hall of the Sun, frowned at the sight of the maidens, and maybe at the young Karienen. Older folk usually looked askance at the younglings carrying on every bit as much as the Aiel did. More than one parent had tried to put an end to it, had ordered sons or daughters to give over, instructed armsmen and servants to chase off others' like-minded sons and daughters like common vagrants or street ruffians. Perrin would not have been surprised if these doormen slanted their gilded staffs to stop Solanda and her friends from entering through the open doorways, nobility or not, and perhaps even the maidens. Few Karienen still dared call Aiel savages, not where they could be heard, but most thought it. The pair gathered themselves, drew deep breaths, and saw Rand over the maidens' heads. Their eyes nearly popped out of their faces. Each man glanced sideways at the other, and then they were on their knees. One stared fixedly at the floor, the other squeezed his eyes shut, and Perrin heard him praying under his breath. "So I am loved," Rand said softly. He hardly sounded himself. Min touched his arm, her face pained. Rand patted her hand without looking at her, and for some reason that seemed to pain her even more. The Grand Hall of the Sun was immense, with an angle-vaulted ceiling a full 50 paces high at its peak, and great golden lamps hung on gilded chains thick enough to move the gates of a fortress. It was immense, and it was full, people crowding among massive square columns of blue-black veined marble that stood in 2 rows to either side of the center aisle. The folk at the rear noticed the newcomers first. In long coats and short, some in bright colors or embroidered, some travel-worn, they stared curiously, intently. The few women in the back of the hall wore riding dresses and had faces as hard as the men, gazes as direct. Hunters for the horn, Perrin thought. Dobrain had said that every noble who could be there would, and most hunters were nobly born, or claimed to be. Whether or not they recognized Rand, they sensed something, hands feeling for swords and daggers that were not there this evening. More hunters than not sought adventure and a place in the histories along with the Horn of Valir. Even if they did not know the Dragon Reborn, they knew danger when they saw it. The others in the Grand Hall were less attuned to danger, or rather, more to intrigues and plots than to open hazard. Perrin was a third of the way down the long center aisle, close on Rand's heels, before gasps ran through the chamber like a wind. Pale Karienen lords with colorful slashes across the chests of their dark silk coats, some with the front of their heads shaved and powdered. Karienen ladies with stripes on their dark high-necked gowns and lace falls covering their hands, their hair in intricate towers that often added a good foot of height. Tyrant high lords and lords of the land with oiled beards trimmed to points, in velvet hats and coats of red and blue and every color, with puffy satin-striped sleeves. Tyrant ladies in even more colorful gowns, with wide lace ruffs and close caps studded with pearls and moonstones, fire drops and rubies. They knew Perrin, and they knew Dobrain, and even Javian and Min. But most importantly, they knew Rand. A ripple of knowing that kept pace up the hall with him. Eyes widening, jaws dropping, they went so stiff Perrin almost thought the Ashaman had bound them like the guards outside the palace. The chamber was a sea of sweet perfumes, and beneath that, undercurrents of salty sweat. But through it oozed fear, a quivering sort of smell. His attention was all on the far end of the hall, though, on the deep blue marble dais where the sun throne stood, shining like its namesake with gilt, the wavy-rayed rising sun huge atop the high back. Coliver rose slowly, peering down the aisle over Rand's head. Her nearly black dress bore not a single stripe of nobility, but the great mass of curls rising above her head had to have been dressed around the crown she wore, the rising sun in gold and yellow diamonds. 7 young women flanked the sun throne in dark bodiced gowns with lace snugged under their chins and skirts striped vertically in Coliver's yellow and red and silver. It seemed that Carianan fashion was different for the queen and for the queen's attendants. A flicker of motion behind the throne picked out an 8th woman, hidden, but Perrin cared about neither Coliver nor anyone else except the woman to her ultimate right, Fail. Her slightly tilted eyes fastened on him, dark liquid moons, yet not a line altered of her coolly decorous expression. If anything, her face grew tighter. His nose strained for the scent of her, but the perfume was too strong, and the fear. She had a reason for being there on the dais, a good reason. She did. Rand touched Sulan's sleeve. "Wait here," he said. Scowling, the scar on her leathery face standing out as white as her hair, she scanned his face, then nodded with obvious reluctance. Her free hand gestured anyway, and another gasp ran through the chamber as the maidens veiled. It was almost laughable. The 8 men in black coats trying to watch everywhere at once could probably kill them all before the first maiden drove home a spear, but no one knew who or what they were. No one looked at them twice, a handful of men with their swords sheathed, only at the maidens. And Rand. Hadn't they noticed that not a one of those men sweated a drop more than Rand? Perrin felt as if he were bathing in his. Stepping past the maidens, with men still close beside him, Rand stopped as first Perrin, then Dobrain and Javian joined him. And Aram, of course, like Perrin's shadow. Rand studied them each in turn, nodding slowly. He studied Perrin longest, and took the longest time to nod. The gray-haired Carianan and the young Mayenner wore faces like death. Perrin did not know how his own looked, but his jaw was locked tight. No one was going to harm Fail, no matter what she had done, no matter why, no matter what he had to do to stop it. Their boots drummed loud in the silence as they crossed the huge golden mosaic of the rising sun in the blue-tiled floor and approached the throne. Hands gripping her skirts, Coliver wet her lips, and her eyes darted between Rand and the doors behind him. "Looking for Aes Sedai?" Rand's voice echoed. He smiled unpleasantly. "I sent them to the Aiel camp. If the Aiel can't teach them manners, no one can." A shocked murmur rose and fell raggedly. Fear became stronger than the perfumes in Perrin's nose. Coliver gave a start. "Why would I—" Drawing a deep breath, she gathered dignity. A more than handsome woman in her middle years, without a touch of gray in her dark hair, she bore a regal presence that had nothing to do with the crown. She had been born to command, to reign, so she thought. And her eyes, weighing and measuring, betrayed a hard intelligence. "My Lord Dragon," she said, making a curtsy so deep it nearly mocked itself, "I welcome you back. Carian welcomes you back." The way she said it, she seemed to be repeating herself. Slowly, Rand climbed the steps of the dais. Min half made to follow him, then folded her arms. Perrin did follow, to be near Fail, but only part way. It was her gaze that stopped him. A gaze that probed every bit as much as Coliver's. At him, as much as at Rand. Perrin wished he could smell her. Not to try discovering why or what, just for the smell of her. The wash of perfumes and fright was too great. Why did she not speak? Why did she not come to him, or smile? Just a smile. Coliver stiffened a splinter's worth, but only that. Her head came no more than level with Rand's chest, though her towered hair rose almost as tall as he. His eyes slid from her face, and along the women lined up on either side of the throne. He might have paused on Fail. Perrin could not be sure. Rand rested his hand on one heavy arm of the Sun Throne. You know I mean this for Elaine Trakand. His voice was emotionless. My Lord Dragon, Kolover replied smoothly. Carian had been too long without a ruler. A Carianan ruler. You yourself said you have no interest in the Sun Throne for yourself. Elaine Trakand would have had some claim. A small, quick gesture dismissed such a claim. If she were alive. Rumor says she is dead, like her mother. A dangerous thing to say. A good many rumors said Rand had killed both mother and daughter. The woman was no coward. Elaine is alive. The words were still flat as a plain board, but Rand's eyes burned. Perrin could not pick out his smell any more than Fail's, but he did not need his nose to know rage bottled right in front of him. She will have the crowns of Andor and of Carian. My Lord Dragon, what is done cannot be undone. If anything has offended you, for all her dignity, all her courage, Kolover made a visible effort not to flinch as Rand reached out and took hold of the sun crown. There was a loud crack of metal snapping, and the crown flexed, hardly disarraying her tower of curls as it pulled away, slowly straightening. A few of the brilliant yellow stones popped from their settings and fell. He held up the stretched arc of metal, and slowly it bent back on itself until the ends met, and maybe the Ashaman could see what happened, could understand, but to Perrin, one moment the crown was broken, the next it was whole again. No one among the nobles made a sound, not even a shuffling of boots. Perrin thought they might be afraid too. To his nose, stark terror was stronger than any other scent now. It did not quiver, it spasmed wildly. Whatever can be done, Rand said softly, can be undone. Kolover's face drained of blood. The few wisps of hair that had escaped her coiffure made her seem wild, at bay. Swallowing, she opened her mouth twice before any words came out. My Lord Dragon. It was a breathy whisper, but as she went on, her voice became stronger and edged with desperation. She seemed to forget anyone else was present. I have kept the laws you made, maintained your policies, even those that go against the ancient laws of Carian, against all custom. She probably meant the laws that had let a noble kill a farmer or craftsman and walk away. My Lord Dragon, the Sun Throne is yours to give. I know that. I was wrong to take it without your leave. But I have the right to it, by birth and blood. If I must have it from your hand, then give it to me by your hand. I have the right. Rand only looked at her. He said nothing. He seemed to be listening, but not to her. Perrin cleared his throat. Why was Rand dragging this out? It was done, or nearly. Let whatever else had to be done be done. Then he could take Fail away, where they could talk. Did you have the right to murder Lord Marengil and High Lord Mylan? Perrin demanded. There was no doubt in his mind that she had had it done. They had been her biggest rivals for the throne. Or she and they thought they were, anyway. Why was Rand just standing there? He knew all of this. Where is Barrelane? Before the name was off his tongue, he wanted to call it back. Fail only glanced at him, her face still a cool mask of propriety, but that glance could have set water aflame. A jealous wife is like a hornet's nest in your mattress, the saying went. No matter how you twitched, you got stung. You dare accuse me of so vile a crime? Kolover demanded. There is no proof. There can be no proof. Not when I am innocent. Abruptly, she seemed to become aware of where she was, of the nobles crowded shoulder to shoulder among the columns, watching and listening. Whatever else could be said of her, she did have courage. Standing straight, she did her best to stare Rand in the eye without tilting her head too far back. My Lord Dragon, 9 days ago at sunrise, I was crowned Queen of Carian according to the laws and usages of Carian. I will keep my oath of fealty to you, but I am Queen of Carian. Rand only stared at her, silent. And troubled, Perrin would have said. My Lord Dragon, I am Queen, unless you would rip all our laws away. Still silence from Rand, and an unblinking stare. Why doesn't he end it, Perrin wondered. These charges against me are false. They are mad. Only that silent stare for answer. Colabert moved her head uneasily. Anura, advise me. Come, Anura, advise me. Perrin thought she spoke to one of the women with Fail, but the woman who stepped from behind the throne did not wear the striped skirts of an attendant. A broad face with a wide mouth and a beak of a nose regarded Rand from beneath dozens of long, thin, dark braids. An ageless face. To Perrin's surprise, Javian made a sound in his throat and began grinning. His own hackles were standing straight. I cannot do this, Colabert, the Aes Sedai said in a Tarabana accent, shifting her gray-fringed shawl. I fear I have allowed you to misperceive my relationship to you. Drawing a deep breath, she added, There is no need for this, Master Althor. Her voice became slightly unsteady for a moment. Or, my Lord Dragon, if you prefer. I assure you, I harbor no ill intentions toward you. If I did, I would have struck before you knew I was here. You might well have died if you had. Rand's voice was icy steel. His face made it seem soft. I'm not who has shielded you, Aes Sedai. Who are you? Why are you here? Answer me! I don't have much patience with your kind. Unless you want to be hauled out to the Aiel camp, I wager the wise ones can make you speak freely. This Anura was not slow-witted. Her eyes darted to Aram, then to the aisle where the Ashaman stood. And she knew. They had to be who he meant in their black coats, grim faces dry when every other but hers and Rand's glistened. Young Jahar was watching her like a hawk watching a rabbit. Incongruously, Loyal stood in the midst of them with his axe propped against his shoulder. One big hand managed to hold an ink bottle and an open book, pressed awkwardly against his chest, while the other scribbled as fast as he could dip a pen fatter than Perrin's thumb. He was taking notes. Here. The nobles heard Rand as well as Anura did. They had been watching the veiled maidens uneasily. Now they crowded back from the Ashaman, pressing together like fish in a barrel. Here and there someone sagged in a faint, held up by the throng. Shivering, Anura adjusted her shawl and regained all the vaunted Aes Sedai composure. I am Anura Larison, my Lord Dragon, of the Grey Adja. Nothing about her said that she was shielded, and in the presence of men who could channel. She seemed to answer as a favor. I am the advisor to Berelain, first of Mayenne. So that was why Javian was grinning like a madman. He had recognized the woman. Perrin did not feel like grinning at all. This has been kept secret, you understand, she went on, because of the attitude of Tyr, both toward Mayenne and toward Aes Sedai. But I think me the time for secrets, it is past, yes? Anura turned to Colabert, and her mouth firmed. I let you think what you would think. But Aes Sedai do not become advisors simply because someone tells them they are. Most especially when they already advised someone else. If Berlane confirms your story, Rand said, I will parole you to her custody. Looking at the crown, he seemed to realize for the first time that the spray of gold and gems was still in his hand. Very gently, he set it on the silk-covered seat of the Sun Throne. I don't think every Aes Sedai is my enemy. Not entirely. But I won't be schemed against, and I won't be manipulated. Not anymore. It's your choice, Honora. But if you make the wrong one, you will go to the wise ones. If you live long enough. I won't hobble the Ashaman, and a mistake could cost you. The Ashaman, Honora said calmly. I quite understand. But she touched her lips with her tongue. My Lord Dragon, Colabert plotted to break her oath of fealty. Perrin had wished so hard for Fail to speak that he jumped when she did, stepping out of the line of attendants. Choosing her words carefully, she confronted the would-be queen like a stooping eagle. Light, but she was beautiful. Colabert swore to obey you in all things and uphold your laws, but she has made plans to rid Cairhien of the Aiel, to send them south and return all to as it was before you came. She also said that if you ever returned, you would not dare change anything she had done. The woman she told these things, Mare, was one of her attendants. Mare vanished soon after telling me. I have no proof, but I believe she is dead. I believe Colabert regretted revealing too much of her mind, too soon. Dobrain strode up the steps to the dais, his helmet under his arm. His face might have been cold iron. Colabert Saigon, he announced in a formal voice that carried to every corner of the Grand Hall. By my immortal soul under the light, I, Dobrain, High Seat of House Taborwin, do arraign and censure you of treason, the penalty for which is death. Rand's head went back, eyes closed. His mouth moved slightly, but Perrin knew that only he and Rand heard what was said. No, I cannot. I will not. Perrin understood the delay now. Rand was searching for a way out. Perrin wished he could see one. Colabert certainly did not hear, but she wanted a way out too. She looked around wildly, to the Sun Throne, to her other attendants, to the assembled nobility, as though they might step forward to defend her. Their feet could as well have been set in cement. A sea of carefully blank, sweaty faces confronted her, and eyes that avoided hers. Some of those eyes rolled toward the Ashaman, but not too openly. The already considerable space between nobles and Ashaman widened noticeably. Lies, she hissed, hands knotted in her skirts. All lies, you sneaking little... She took a step toward Fail. Rand stretched his arm between them, though Colabert appeared not to see it, and Fail looked as though she wished he had not. Anyone who attacked her was in for a surprise. Fail does not lie, Perrin growled. Well, not about something like this. Once again, Colabert recovered herself. Slight as her height was, she drew up every inch of it. Perrin almost admired her. Except for Mylan and Marangil and this mare, and the light alone knew how many others. I demand justice, my Lord Dragon. Her voice was calm, stately, royal. There is no proof of any of this filth. A claim that someone who is no longer in Cairhien says I spoke words I never did? I demand the Lord Dragon's justice. By your own laws, there must be proof. How do you know she is no longer in Cairhien? Dobrain demanded. Where is she? I assume she is gone. She addressed her answer to Rand. Mare left my service, and I replaced her with Rila there. She gestured toward the third attendant on the left. I have no idea where she is. Bring her forward if she is in the city, and let her make these ridiculous charges to my face. I will fling her lies in her face. Fail looked further at her. Perrin hoped she would not produce one of those knives she kept hidden about her. She had a habit of doing that when she became angry enough. Anura cleared her throat. She had been studying Rand much too closely for Perrin's comfort. She reminded him of Varen suddenly, that look of a bird examining a worm. May I speak, Master... my Lord Dragon? At his curt nod, she was adjusting her shawl. Of young Mare, I know nothing except that one morning she was here, and before nightfall she was nowhere to be found, and none knew where she had gone. But Lord Moringill and High Lord Mylan, they are a different matter. The first of Mayenne, she brought with her two most excellent chieftains, men experienced in carrying crimes. They have brought before me two of the men who waylaid the High Lord Mylan in the streets, though both insist they only held his arms while others did the stabbing. Also, they brought me the servant who put poison in the spiced wine Lord Moringill liked to drink at bedtime. She also protests her true innocence. Her invalid mother would have died, and she herself had Lord Moringill not. So she says, and in her case, I believe she speaks truly. Her solace at confession was not false, I think. Both the men and the woman agree in this. The orders for their actions came from the mouth of Lady Colliver herself. Word by word, the defiance leached out of Colliver. She still stood, yet it seemed to wonder. She appeared as limp as a damp rag. They promised, she mumbled to Rand. They promised you would never return. Too late, she clamped both her hands over her mouth. Her eyes bulged. Perrin wished he could not hear the words coming from her throat. No one should make sounds like that. Treason and murder, Dobrain sounded satisfied. Those winter screams did not touch her. The penalty is the same, my Lord Dragon. Death. Except by your new law, it is hanging for murder. For some reason, Rand looked at Min. She returned his gaze with profound sadness. Not for Colliver, for Rand. Perrin wondered whether a viewing was involved. I demand the headsman, Colliver managed in a strangled voice. Her face sagged. She had become old on the spot, and her eyes were mirrors of stark terror. But with nothing left, she fought on for the scraps. It is my right. I will not be hanged like some commoner. Rand seemed to struggle with himself, shaking his head in that disturbing way. When he spoke at last, his words were winter cold and anvil hard. Colliver Saigon, I strip you of your titles. He drove the words like nails. I strip you of your lands and estates and possessions. Of everything but the dress you stand in. Did you own a farm? A small farm? Each sentence staggered the woman. She swayed drunkenly on her feet, soundlessly mouthing the word farm as if she had never heard it before. Anura, Fail, everyone stared at Rand in amazement or curiosity or both. Perrin not least. A farm? If there had been silence in the Grand Hall before, now it seemed that no one even breathed. Dobrain, did she own a small farm? She owned many farms, my Lord Dragon, the Carian replied slowly. Clearly, he understood no more than Perrin did. Most are large. but the lands near the Dragon Wall have always been divided into small holdings, less than 50 hides. All of the tenants abandoned them during the Aiel War. Rand nodded. Time to change that. Too much land has lain fallow too long. I want to move people back there to farm again. Dobrain, you will find out which farm of those Colaver owned near the Dragon Wall is the smallest. Colaver, I exile you to that farm. Dobrain will see you're provided with what is needed to make a farm work, and with someone to teach you how to till the soil. And with guards to see that you never go farther from it, and you can walk in a day so long as you live. See to it, Dobrain. In a week, I want her on her way. A bewildered Dobrain hesitated before nodding. Aaron could catch murmurs from the assembly behind him now. This was unheard of. None understood why she was not to die. And the rest? Estates had been confiscated before, but never all. Never nobility itself. Nobles had been exiled, even for life, but never to a farm. Oliver's response was immediate. Eyes rolling up in her head, she collapsed, crumpling backward toward the steps. Perrin darted to catch her, but someone was ahead of him. Before he had taken a full step, her fall simply stopped. She slumped in midair, slanting over the steps to the dais, head dangling. Slowly, her unconscious form rose, swung around, and settled gently in front of the sun throne. Rand. Perrin was sure the Ashaman would have let her fall. Anura tisked. She did not appear surprised or perturbed, except that her thumbs rubbed her forefingers nervously. I suspect she would have preferred the headsman. I will see to her if you have your man, your, Ashaman. She's not your concern, Rand said roughly. She is alive, and she is alive. He drew a long, ragged breath. Min was there before he let it out. She only stood near him, yet she looked as if she wanted to do something more. Slowly, his face firmed. Anura, you will take me to Berlane. Release her, Jahar. She'll be no trouble. Not with one of her and 9 of us. I want to find out what has been going on while I was away, Anura, and what Berlane means bringing you here behind my back. No, don't speak. I'll hear it from her. Perrin, I know you want some time with Fail. Rand's gaze swept slowly around the hall, over all the nobles waiting silently. Under his stare, none dared move a muscle. The scent of fear far outweighed any other, convulsing sharply. Except for the hunters, everyone there had given him the same oath as had Colaver. Perhaps just being in this gathering was treason too? Baron did not know. This audience is at an end, Rand said. I will forget every face that departs now. Those at the front, the highest ranking, the most powerful, began their progress toward the doors without too much haste, avoiding the maidens and the Ashaman standing in the aisle, while the rest waited their turn. Every mind must have been turning over what Rand had said, though. What precisely did he mean by now? Purposeful strides quickened, skirts were lifted. Hunters, nearest the doors, began slipping out, first one at a time, then in a flood. And seeing them, lesser nobles among the Carianan and Tyrans departed ahead of the higher. In moments, it was a milling mass at the doors, men and women pushing and elbowing to get out. Not one looked back at the woman stretched out before the throne she had held so briefly. Chapter 6. Old Fear and New Fear. Rand passed through the struggling mob without any difficulty, of course. Maybe it was the presence of the maidens and the Ashaman. Or maybe Rand or one of the black-coated fellows did something with the power, but the crowd parted for him, with Min holding to his arm, and a very subdued Anura attempting to speak to him, and Loyal, who was still trying with some difficulty to write in his book, and carry his axe. Staring at one another, Perrin and Fail missed their chance to join them before the crowd closed up again. She said nothing for a time, and neither did he. Not what he wanted to say, not with Aram there, staring at them like some worshipful hound. And Dobrain, frowning down at the unconscious woman put in his charge. No one else remained on the dais. Avian had gone with Rand to find Berlane, and as soon as Rand went, the other attendants had darted away toward the doors without a second glance at Perrin or Fail, or Coliver. Without the first glance, for that matter. They just lifted their striped skirts and ran. Grunts and curses drifted from the pack, not all in men's voices. Even with Rand gone, those people wanted to be elsewhere, and now. Perhaps they thought Perrin stayed to watch and report, though had any glanced back, they would have seen his eyes were not on them. Climbing the rest of the way, he took Fail's hand and breathed in the scent of her. This close, the lingering perfumes did not matter. Anything else could wait. She produced a red lace fan from somewhere, and before spreading it to cool herself, touched first her cheek, then his. There was a whole language of fans in her native Saldaea. She had taught him a little. He wished he knew what the cheek touching meant. It must be something good. On the other hand, her scent carried a spiky shading he knew too well. He should have sent her to the block, Dobrain muttered, and Perrin shrugged uncomfortably. From the man's tone, it was not clear whether he meant that that was what the law called for, or that it would have been more merciful. Dobrain did not understand. Rand could have sprouted wings first. Fail's fan slowed to barely moving, and she eyed Dobrain sideways over the crimson lace. Her death might be best for everyone. That is the prescribed penalty. What will you do, Lord Dobrain? Sidelong or not, it still managed to be very direct, a very meaningful gaze. Perrin frowned. Not a word for him, and there was that undertone of jealousy in her aroma, making him sigh. The Karianan gave her a level look in a return, while thrusting his gauntlets behind his sword belt. What I was commanded to do. I keep my oaths, Lady Fail. The fan snapped open and shut, faster than thought. He actually sent Aes Sedai to the Aiel? As prisoners? Disbelief tinged her voice. Some, Lady Fail. Dobrain hesitated. Some swore fealty on their knees. This I saw with my own eyes. They went to the Aiel too, but I do not think they can be called prisoners. I saw it too, my lady, Aram put in from his place on the steps, and a wide smile split his face when she glanced at him. Red lace described a fluttering hitch. What she did with the fan seemed almost unconscious. You both saw. The relief in her voice and in her scent was so strong that Perrin stared. What did you think, Fail? Would Rand lie, especially when everyone would know in a day? Instead of answering immediately, she frowned down at Coliver. Is she still under? Not that it matters, I suppose. She knows more than I would say here. Everything we worked so hard to keep hidden. She let that slip to Mare, too. She knows too much. Dobrain thumbed one of Coliver's eyes open none too gently. As if hit with a mace. A pity she did not break her neck on the steps. But she will go to her exile and learn to live as a farmer. A brief, jaggedy, vexed smell wafted from Fail. Abruptly it hit Perrin what his wife had been proposing so obliquely, what Dobrain had rejected just as indirectly. Every hair in his body tried to stand. From the start he had known that he had married a very dangerous woman, just not how dangerous. Aram was peering at Colivert, his lips pursed in dark thought. The man would do anything for Fail. I don't think Rand would like it if anything prevented her reaching that farm, Perrin said firmly, eyeing Aram and Fail in turn. I wouldn't like it either. He felt rather proud of himself. That was talking around the point as well as any of them. Aram bowed his head briefly.
Christopher, how you
He
doing?
understood, but Fail tried to look innocent above her gently fluttering fan, with no notion what he was talking about. Suddenly he realized not all the fear scent came from the people still milling at the door. A thin, quivering thread of it wafted from her. Fear under control, yet it was there. What's the matter, Fail? Light, you'd think Corin and that lot had won instead of... Her face did not change, but the thread grew thicker. Is that why you didn't say anything at first? He asked softly. Were you afraid we had come back as puppets, and them pulling the strings? She eyed the rapidly diminishing crowd across the grand hall. The nearest of them was a long way, and all making a good deal of noise, but she lowered her voice even so. Aes Sedai can do that sort of thing, I've heard. My husband, no one knows more than I that even Aes Sedai would find hard times trying to make you dance for a puppet. Much harder than a man who's just the dragon reborn. But when you walked in here, I was more afraid than at any time since you left. Amusement trickled through in the first of that, like tiny bubbles in his nose, and warm fondness and love, the smell of her clear and pure and strong. But all of those faded by the end, leaving that thin, trembling thread. Light, Fail. It's true.
Oh, not much, just chilling.
Every word Rand said.
Enjoying a little bit of a bowl.
You heard Dobrain and Aram?
How about you? How's your
She
evening going,
smiled and
Christopher?
nodded and worked her fan. That thread still quivered in his nostrils, though. Blood and ashes, what does it take to convince her? Would it help if he had Varen dance the Sassara? She will, if he tells her to. He meant it for a joke. All he knew of the Sassara was that it was scandalous, and that Fail had once admitted knowing how to dance it, though recently she sidestepped and all but denied it. He meant it for a joke, but she closed her fan and tapped it on her wrist. He knew that one. I am giving your suggestion serious thought. I don't know what would be enough, Perrin. She shivered slightly. Is there anything an Aes Sedai would not do or put up with if the White Tower told her to? I have studied my history, and I was taught to read between the lines. Mashera Danavel bore 7 children for a man she loathed, whatever the stories say. And Isabai Tobanyi delivered the brothers she loved to their enemies and the throne of Ara-Daman with them. And Jestyn Redhill? She shivered again, not so slightly. It's all right, he murmured, wrapping her in his arms. He had studied several books of history himself, but he had never seen those names. The daughter of a lord received a different education from a blacksmith's apprentice. It really is true. Dobrain averted his eyes, and so did Aram, though with a pleased grin. She resisted at first, but not very hard. He could never be sure when she would avoid a public embrace, and when welcome it. Only that if she did not want one, she made it clear in no uncertain terms, with or without words. This time she snuggled her face into his chest and hugged him back, squeezing harder. If any Aes Sedai ever harms you, she whispered, I will kill her. He believed her. You belong to me, Perrin Tabashir Ebara. To me. He believed that, too. As her hug grew fiercer, so did the thorny scent of jealousy. He almost chuckled. It seemed the right to put a knife in him was reserved to her. He would have chuckled, except that filament of fear remained. That and what she had said about Mare. He could not smell himself, but he knew what was there. Fear. Old fear and new fear for the next time. The last of the nobles forced their way from the Grand Hall without anyone being trampled, sending Aram off to tell Daniel to bring the Two Rivers men into the city, and wondering how he was going to feed them. Perrin offered Fail his arm and led her out, leaving Dobrain with Colivert, who was finally showing signs of awakening. He had no wish to be around when she woke, and Fail, with her hand on his wrist, seemed not to either. They walked quickly, eager to reach their rooms, if not necessarily for the same reasons. The nobles apparently had not stopped their flight once they were out of the Grand Hall. The corridors were empty except for servants who kept their eyes down and moved at a silent rush. But before they had gone very far, Perrin caught the sound of footsteps and realized they were being followed. It seemed unlikely that Colivert had any open supporters still, but if there were any, they might think to strike at Rand through his friend, walking alone with his wife while the Dragon Reborn was elsewhere. Only when Perrin spun about, hand to his axe, he stared instead of drawing the weapon. It was Salanda and her friends from the entry hall, with 8 or 9 new faces. They gave a start when he turned and exchanged abashed glances. Some were Tyrans, including a woman who stood taller than all but one of the Carianan men. She wore a man's coat and tight breeches, just like Salanda and the rest of the women, with a sword on her hip. He had not heard that this nonsense had spread to the Tyrans. "Why are you following us?" he demanded. "If you try to make me any of your woolhead trouble, I vow I'll kick the lot of you from here to Beltane." He had had problems before with these idiots, or some just like them anyway. All they thought about was their honor and fighting duels, and taking one another gaishine. That last really set the Aiel's teeth on edge. "Attend my husband and obey," Fail put in sharply. "He is not a man to be trifled with." Gawking stares vanished, and they backed away, bowing, competing over flourishes. They were still at it when they vanished around a turn. "Bloody young buffoons," Perrin muttered, offering Fail his wrist again. "My husband is wise in his years," she murmured. Her tone was utterly serious. Her smell was something else again. Perrin managed not to snort. True, a few of them might be a year or two older than he, but they were all like children with their playing at Aiel. Now, with Fail in a good mood, seemed as good a time as any to begin what they had to talk about, what he had to talk about. "Fail, how did you come to be one of Colivert's attendants?" "The servants, Perrin." She spoke softly. Nobody 2 steps away could have heard a word. She knew all about his hearing and the wolves. That was nothing a man could keep from his wife. Her fan touched her ear, admonishing caution in speech. "Too many people forget servants are there, but servants listen too. In Carian, they listen far too much." None of the liveried people he saw were doing any listening. The few who did not duck down side corridors when they saw him and Fail went by at a near run, gazes on the floor, and gathered in on themselves. Any sort of news spread quickly in Carian. Events in the Grand Hall would have flown. The word was in the streets by now, probably on its way out of the city already. Without any doubt, there were eyes and ears in Carian for the Aes Sedai and the White Cloaks, and likely more thrones than not. In that hushed voice, she went on despite her caution to him. "Colivert could not be fast enough to take me in, once she learned who I am. My father's name impressed her as much as my cousin's." She finished with a little nod, as if she had answered everything. It was a good answer. Almost. Her father was Davram, high seat of House Bashir, Lord of Bashir, Tyre, and Sedona, guardian of the Blight Border, defender of the Heartland, and Marshal General to Queen Tenobia of Saldaea. Fail's cousin was Tenobia herself. More than reason for Colivert to leap at Fail for one of her attendants. But he had had time to mull things over now, and he prided himself that he was becoming used to her ways. Married life taught a man about women, or about one woman anyway. The answer she had not given confirmed something. Fail had no concept of danger, not where she herself was concerned. He could not speak of it there in the corridor, of course. Whisper how he would. She did not have his ears, and doubtless she would insist every servant within 50 paces was listening. Holding his patience, he walked on with her until they reached the rooms that had been set aside for them, what seemed an age ago now. The lamps had been lit, making shimmers on the dark polished walls, each tall wooden panel carved in concentric rectangles. In the square stone fireplace, the hearth was swept bare and laid with a few pitiful branches of leather leaf. They were almost green. Fail went straight to a small table where 2 golden pitchers stood beaded with moisture on a tray. They have left us blueberry tea, my husband, and wine punch. The wine is from Theron, I think. They cool the punch in the cisterns beneath the palace. Which would you prefer? Theron unbuckled his belt and tossed belt and axe on a chair. He had planned out what he had to say very carefully on the way here. She could be a prickly woman. Fail, I missed you more than I can say, and worried about you, but worried about me, she snapped, spinning to face him. She stood straight and tall, eyes fierce as those of her falcon namesake, and her fan made a coring motion toward his middle. No part of the language of fans. She made the same gesture with a knife sometimes. When almost the first words from your mouth were to ask after that woman... His jaw dropped. How could he have forgotten the smell filling his nostrils? He nearly put a hand up to see whether his nose was bleeding. Fail, I wanted her thief catchers. No, he was not stupid enough to repeat that name. She said she had proof of the poison before I left. You heard her. I just wanted the proof, Fail. It did no good. That spiky stench softened not a whit, and the thin, sour smell of hurt joined it. What under the light had he said to hurt her? Her proof! What I gathered went for nothing, but her proof put Coliver's head on the block, or should have. That was his opening, but she was not about to let him push a word in edgewise. She advanced on him, looking daggers, her fan darting like one. All he could do was back away. Do you know what story that woman put about? Fail almost hissed. A black viper could not have dripped so much venom. Do you? She said the reason you were not here was that you were at a manor not far from the city, where she could visit you. I told the story I prepared, that you were hunting, and the light knows you spent enough days hunting, but everyone believed I was putting a good face on you and her. Together. Coliver delighted in it. I could believe she only took that Mayenner strumpet as an attendant to throw the 2 of us together. Fail, Berylane, come lace my gown. Fail, Berylane, come hold the mirror for the hairdresser. Fail, Berylane, come wash my back. So she could amuse herself, waiting for us to claw one another's eyes out. That is what I've had to put up with. For you, you hairy-eared... His back thumped against the wall, and something snapped inside him. He had been frightened spitless for her, terrified, ready to face down Rand or the Dark One himself. And he had done nothing, had never encouraged Berylane, had done everything in his wits to chase the woman away. For which his thanks was this. Gently he took her by the shoulders and lifted her until those big tilted eyes were level with his. You listen to me, he said calmly. He tried to make his voice calm, at least. It came out more of a growl in his throat. How dare you speak to me like that? How dare you? I worried myself near to death for fear you'd been hurt. I love you, and nobody else but you. I want no other woman but you. Do you hear me? Do you? Crushing her to his chest, he held her, wanting to never let her go. Light he had been so afraid. He shook even now for what might have been. If anything happened to you, I'd die, Fail. I would lie down on your grave and die. Do you think I don't know how Coliver found out who you are? You made sure she found out. Spying, she had told him once, was a wife's work. Light woman, you could have ended like Mare. Kolaver knows you're my wife. My wife. Perene Bara. Randall Thor's friend. Did it ever occur to you she might be suspicious? She could have... Light Fail, she could have... Abruptly, he realized what he was doing. She was making sounds against his chest, but no words he could recognize. He wondered that he did not hear her ribs cracking. Berating himself for an oath, he let her go, arms springing apart. But before he could apologize, her fingers clutched his beard. "So you love me," she said softly, very softly, very warmly. She was smiling, too. A woman likes to hear that said the right way. She had dropped the fan, and her free hand drew fingernails down his cheek, not far from hard enough to draw blood. But her throaty laugh held heat, and the smoldering in her eyes was as far from anger as possible. A good thing you didn't say you never looked at another woman, or I would think you had gone blind. He was too stunned for words, too stunned even to gape. Rand understood women. Matt understood women. But Perrin knew he never would. She was always as much kingfisher as falcon, changing direction faster than he could think. Yet this... That thorny scent was gone completely, and in its place was another smell of her he knew well. A smell that was her, pure and strong and clean. Add that to her eyes, and any moment she was going to say something about farm girls at harvest. They were notorious, apparently, Saldaean farm girls. "As for you lying down on my grave," she went on, "if you do, my soul will haunt yours, I promise you. You will mourn me a decent time, and then you'll find yourself another wife. Someone I'd approve of, I hope." With a soft laugh, she stroked his beard. "You really aren't fit to take care of yourself, you know. I want your promise." Best not to crack his teeth on that. Say he would not, and this wonderful mood might be swallowed in a firestorm. Quicksilver was not in it, really. Say he would, by the smell of her, every word was the light's pure truth. But he would believe that when horses roosted in trees. He cleared his throat. "I need to bathe. I haven't seen soap in I don't know how long. I must smell like an old barn." Leaning against his chest, she drew a deep breath. "You smell wonderful. Like you." Her hands moved on his shoulders. "I feel as..." The door banged open. "Perrin! Berylane isn't..." "I'm sorry. Forgive me." Rand stood shifting his feet, not at all like the Dragon Reborn. There were maidens in the hallway outside. Min put her head around the doorframe, took one look, grinned at Perrin, and ducked back out of sight. Fail stepped away so smoothly, so stately, that one would never have guessed what she had been saying a moment before, or what she had been about to say. There was some color in her cheeks, though, bright and hot. "So kind of you, my Lord Dragon," she said coolly, "to drop in so unexpectedly. I apologize for not hearing your knock." Maybe those blushes were as much anger as embarrassment. It was Rand's turn to blush and scrub a hand through his hair. "Berylane isn't in the palace. She's spending the night on that sea folk ship anchored in the river, of all things. Anura didn't tell me till I was nearly to Berylane's apartments." Perrin tried very hard not to wince. Why did he have to keep saying the woman's name? "You wanted to talk to me about something else, Rand?" He hoped he had not put too much emphasis in that, yet he hoped Rand caught it. He did not look at Fail, but he tested the air gingerly. No jealousy, not yet. A good deal of anger, however. For a moment, Rand stared at him, listening to something else. Perrin folded his arms to stop him. "I need to know," Rand said finally. "Are you still unwilling to command the army against Ilion? I have to know now." "I'm no general," Perrin said raggedly. There would be battles in Ilion. Images flashed in his head. Men all around him, and the axe in his hands spinning, hewing his way through. Always more men, however many he cut down, in endless ranks. And in his heart, a sea of fury. He could not face that again. He would not. Besides, I thought I was supposed to stay close to you. That was what Min had said from one of her viewings. Twice Perrin had to be there, or Rand would go down to disaster.
Cheers, Christopher.
Once had been Dumai's Wells, maybe, but there was still another to come. We must all take risks. Rand's voice was very quiet and very hard. Min peered around the doorframe again, looking as if she wanted to come to him, but she glanced at Fail and stayed outside. Rand, the Aes Sedai. A smart man would let this lie, probably. He had never claimed to be particularly smart, though. The wise ones are ready to skin them alive, or near enough. You can't let them be harmed, Rand. In the corridor, Sulin turned to study him through the doorway. The man he thought he knew laughed, a wheezing sound. We all have to take risks, he repeated. I won't let them be hurt, Rand. Cold blue eyes met his gaze. You won't let it? I won't, Perrin told him levelly. He did not flinch from that stare either. They are prisoners and no threat. They're women. They are Aes Sedai. Rand's voice was so like Aram's back at Dumai's Wells that it nearly took Perrin's breath away. Rand, I do what I have to do, Perrin. For a moment, he was the old Rand, not liking what was happening. For a moment, he looked tired to death. A moment only. Then he was the new Rand again, hard enough to mark steel. I won't harm any Aes Sedai who doesn't deserve it, Perrin. I can't promise more. Since you don't want the army, I can use you elsewhere. Just as well, really. I wish I could let you rest longer than a day or two, but I can't. There's no time. No time, and we must do what we must. Forgive me for interrupting you. He sketched a bow, one hand on the hilt of his sword. Fail. Perrin tried to catch his arm, but he was out of the room, the door closing behind him, before Perrin could move. Rand was not really Rand anymore, it seemed. A day or two. Where in the light did Rand mean him to go, if not to the army gathering down on the plains of Moredo? My husband, Fail breathed. You have the courage of 3 men. And the sense of a child on leading strings. Why is it that as a man's courage goes up, his sense goes down? Perrin grunted indignantly. He refrained from mentioning women who set themselves to spy on people who had committed murders and almost certainly knew they were spying. Women always talked about how logical they were compared to men, but for himself, he had seen precious little of it. Well, perhaps I don't really want the answer, even if you know it. Stretching with her arms over her head, she gave a throaty laugh. Besides, I don't mean to let him spoil the movie. I still feel as forward as a farm girl at... Why are you laughing? Stop laughing at me, Perrin Tabashiri Bara. Stop it, I say, you uncouth oaf. If you don't... The only way to put an end to it was to kiss her. In her arms, he forgot Rand and Aes Sedai and battles. Where Fail was home. Chapter 7. Pitfalls and Tripwires.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this stream for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support.